Rory Sutherland, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure, as ever.
It seems like the Warwick Economics Summit is the latest in like a series, a trail of conferences that you've left in your wake. You're carving out a sort of a new school of economics.
I wouldn't take as much credit for that. What I suppose I would like to do is, I think that economics has a branding crisis, which is that you have. If you think about it, okay, if you look at the mobile phone market, you had iOS, okay, the iPhone. It was unassailable, okay, because you had all these other. Nokia had an operating system, Samsung had an operating system, Huawei had an operating system, etc. Now, what they managed to do, the competition for the most part, Nokia being one exception, is they actually banded together under the aegis of Android. So you can have now, it's a nice choice architecture, you can have an iOS Apple phone, you can have an Android phone. The problem with dissident economics, whether it be Austrian school, econophysics, complexity economics, neo-Marxian economics, punk economics, whatever, is it's incredibly fragmented. And so it's like competing against neoclassical economics is like competing against Coke. You know, you have this one dominant player, and then the opposition is, dissipated and vociferous, I could even say, and that makes it much, much harder for other schools of economics. Now, I'm really saying one thing, which the Austrians, actually Adam Smith said it first, in the sense that he wrote the theory of moral sentiments. He recognised that psychology was deeply important in the understanding of human action, not just the narrow pursuit of self-interest as financially defined or whatever. And so all I'm just doing is basically, it's in the interests of marketing and advertising and just the interest of business in general to understand that actually to model human behaviour as if it were physics is just an extraordinarily dangerous act. But equally, I take a bit of a hit ourselves in saying that the mistake that marketing has made for many years, which is asking people what they want, is pretty damn useless anyway, because we don't know what we want, because chunks of our brain involved in wanting don't connect to the speech modules.
Well, I mean, you've said many times that economists tend to prioritise mechanistic ideas over creative. I'm sure lots of the students you've just spoken to are probably mechanistic thinkers. Well, they might be wondering what exactly you meant by prioritising mechanistic ideas over creative ideas and creative thinking.
It's just that, put it this way, I don't think, I've spent a lot of time reading about these. I'm not even comfortable with the word biases, okay, and it all depends. I mean, it all depends how you define rationality. So I think that very good economist Alan Kerman, who's at the University of Marseille, believes there's a behaviour which is socially rational. So he looked at the Marseille fish market, and they said, what we're going to do is, instead of having all these different fishmongers selling fish, we're going to pool the fish into one central pot, and then we'll auction it all off. It'll be more economically efficient, you'll get more choice, you'll probably pay less for fish. And the fish people didn't want to do it. And they were accused of being economically irrational. Well, hold on a second. When you don't know where the fish comes from, a whole reputational and informational link between you and the fish seller. And what they found is that people who bought fish liked to deal with the same fish vendors every week because they got to know each other's preferences. But also, if the fish vendor ripped them off one week, they could punish them by saying, that haddock you sold me last week was shite, I'm going to go to this bloke next door. And if they really got malicious, they could go around going, don't buy your fish, your haddock from Jacques, it's shite, okay? Now, in game theoretic terms, it's perfectly rational to prefer to deal with people whose identity you know than with anonymised sellers in the setting of an auction. Okay? So what rational is anyway? Is a whole daft debate anyway. And the extent to which economists have seized the word, it's a bit like the word gay, in that you take a word and make it your own and choose to define it any way you like, is probably an act of what you might call lexicographical sabotage, okay, in itself. But so anyway, let's not talk. But the interesting thing about the biases, inverted commas, and heuristics is that knowing about them, I'm not sure I can ever sit down, I'll ever be able to confidently say, you should charge more for that product and demand will go up. Okay? I don't think I'll ever have the confidence to say that. Most of the time, for most people in most categories, when you drop the price of something, demand goes up. When you increase the price, demand goes down, although that's by no means universally a rule. But what I might be able to say is, before you just assume that dropping the price will increase demand, I think you ought to test doing the opposite. And bear in mind, we have a lot of behavioural data at hand nowadays, so that kind of experimentation becomes much faster and much more affordable. So if I achieve nothing else but getting people to banish the axioms and assumptions of neoclassical economics, and indeed the assumptions that consumers, when they explain their behaviour, know what they're talking about, then what at least businesses can do is actually test, and instead of unthinkingly following these assumptions, they can actually test alternatives which may be more profitable and more lucrative. Then we'll make quite a bit of progress.
Well, it seems like neoclassical economics has a lot to learn from this kind of dissident behavioural economics. You argued that riots could have been prevented.
Yes, no, I'm absolutely sincere about that. Yeah, I think it was a terrible presentation of, is it unreasonable if you go to medical school, which is paid for, by the government, and you end up, as a result of your medical training, earning 70,000 a year and 120,000 a year as an anaesthetist? Is it that unreasonable you pay a bit more tax than someone who makes 120,000 quid a year having not gone to uni? I don't think that's unreasonable. But making it alone is a terrible presentation of the proposition. It's completely woeful.
It seems an extraordinarily powerful new science. If it's easier to sell.
I think so. In fact, I think I'm a huge fan of Richard Thaler, but I think calling it nudging possibly undersells its potential value and effect. So you can, simply by changing, for example, the choice architecture on a website, you can increase sales by, 300%.
What I wonder is, by packaging things differently, designing things differently, and selling them differently, we can make these radical changes. Could we not apply something similar? Could we not find a similar solution to a global economic crisis through behavioural economics?
Well, there's certainly an interesting debate, which is one, and this is a question which HMRC have asked and the government's behavioural insights team have asked: can you make paying taxes a badge of honour or a status good? Now, I came to them with the solution, which was obviously politically completely unacceptable, but I still thought was quite clever, which was that higher rate taxpayers should be allowed to drive in bus lanes. Okay? Now, obviously that didn't go down a storm because for various reasons they thought that was a heinous thing to say. But there is a point that the Romans actually did this. In ancient Rome, they had taxes which people competed to pay because the status of being assessed for those taxes was so high that people actually said, no, I'm much richer than that. I should be paying this tax. It's certainly the way that tax is framed. If you take tax as one of the issues with the global economic crisis, the way that tax is framed is that it's almost seen as punitive, is an interesting question. Here's another interesting question, okay, which I think the global economic crisis arose from a framing error, which is that we all tend to see property as worthy and an investment, whereas we see rampant consumerism, like going shopping down Abercrombie, as being vulgar and nasty. Actually, there was a complete and bizarre framing bias at work there, which nobody spotted. Actually, no, not quite true. Steve Keen, the Australian, did. I'd also claim that I did a bit, but I didn't know how to describe it. Which was that nobody on the news went on and said, great news, petrol's gone up, so those of you who got half a tank of petrol in your car are now richer. And yet all property price rises were framed on the news as if they were a good news story. Now, the point is that property is a form of consumption. It's ridiculously undertaxed because you're not taxed on the benefit you get in the shape of free accommodation. If I get a dividend from a share, I'm taxed on that dividend. If I live rent-free in a house I own, I'm not taxed on that benefit. I'm not taxed on the capital gain. I also argue that we need, so this weird bias where property expenditure was treated as an investment, and nobody actually said, if economists had been sensible, they would have said, look, the fact that property prices have gone up by a factor of 6 doesn't mean that the utility people gain from housing has gone up 6 times. What it means is that when housing is a scarce commodity and everybody else starts buying it, at some level you've got no choice but to participate. I've got friends who didn't buy a house, and they're basically fucked. Okay? I'm really sorry. So, friends who I think took the rational and decent thing to say property is overpriced, I don't want to participate. When it then went up by another factor of 3, they basically found themselves homeless for not home owning for life. Okay, anybody born after about 1960 is basically screwed. Okay, now the fact that nobody spotted that what was going on here, that the fact that rising petrol prices are considered a bad thing, whereas rising house prices were considered, hey, more good news. Not helped by the fact that every MP on assuming office was given a free house. Now, if you think about it, if every MP had been given 300 grand's worth of BP shares, people would say, well, it's outrageous, you can't legislate fairly against oil companies if you own 400 grand's worth of BP. But every MP was given a fucking house in London, okay? So it was in their interest for property to go up, that was their pension, okay? Now, the fact that nobody spotted the fact that there was basically a perverse framing bias where property price rises were sold as if they were a great news story strikes me as one of the things that created the crisis in the first place.
It seems then that with the power of changing things, changing how we package things and how we look at things, we can sell something, get a 300% rise in sales, or change the way people think, get people to want to pay more taxes. It makes the people who are good at it very powerful.
Yes. One of the things I think advertising did in the Madman era is it pretended, or it claimed, that that there were no unconscious effects to advertising at all. And it did that to avoid attacks. Books like, for example, The Hidden Persuaders. There were films like The Manchurian Candidate. The United States in that period was obsessed with the idea of brainwashing, communist manipulation, subliminal advertising, which was actually a faked experiment, by the way. I think the experiment which claimed to show subliminal advertising working in a cinema was actually a bit of a fraud. In an act of sort of paranoia, they basically said, no, it just works through naked persuasion in the plain light of day. Now, actually, each of us individually undoubtedly operates, unconscious influences on the people around us all the time. Indeed, we've probably evolved to do it, and rather well. So the idea that someone with access to the mass media can't do the same thing, but an individual can, strikes me as dodgy. So you get into a very important ethical question, and the first thing I do about this is to say, well, first of all, there's if I told my mum I was doing this, would she regard it as wrong? The second thing would be, anything I find, I tell people about. I don't have any secrets. I also think that, there are things like, for example, what the hell is that Kant thing called? The categorical imperative, is that right? Yeah. That's not a bad measure. You ask yourself the question, if everybody else did this, what would happen? Now, unethical marketing, I'll give you an example of how you could very easily market in a way that I think is unethical, although an economist wouldn't say this, actually. John Locke in 1690 wrote a paper, an essay called Venditio, which is about the idea of the just price. And he says, you're not obliged to sell anything for less than you'd be prepared to sell it for. If you had a horse that was worth £5 on the open market, but you really liked it, and a bloke offered you 10, and he said, no, actually, I'm really fond of this horse, he and I go back ages, I wouldn't sell him for less than 12. You're not obliged to sell him to someone for 10. However, if someone then comes to you and says, I'm desperate to get back home because my wife's very ill, I need your horse, will you sell it to me? And he'd pay 25. It's unethical to say, you could sell it to him for 12 and that would be ethical because that's what you'd sell it to anybody else for. But to use knowledge of the person's predicament to charge a higher price, Locke regards that as being unjust. Now, why is that important? In 1690, it probably wasn't very important. However, now Amazon could quite easily use the fact that they knew I was pretty price insensitive to charge me more for books than other people. EasyJet, if they wanted to, could search social media, and if I happen to mention a death or bereavement, they just say, basically, if Rory Sutherland comes to the EasyJet website in the next 2 weeks, double the price, because it's a funeral. He's got no bloody choice but to fly, okay? Now, those things, I think, are interesting cases, because an economist would say, well, actually, it's price, demand, you're willing to pay 300 quid for your flight to Toulouse or whatever. What's gone wrong there? I think Locke would say that was an unjust thing to do. I'd say it was an unjust thing to do. And the frank thing is, if you published it, people would say, that's dodgy. Because we've got an ethical sense, it isn't necessarily connected to our logical modules in our brain, but it is not good marketing to violate those basic ethics. It may not catch up with you, as with selling horse burgers, for example. It may not, you may not actually get punished for it now or tomorrow. And this is why the dangers of short-term business metrics have to be looked at. Because are you actually making higher profits at the price of basically storing up massive reputational risk for the future? Big important question, I think. I think, Coke, interestingly, Coke at one stage, I think under Robert Gosweta, mooted selling a yield management Coke machine where the price would go up when the temperature rose. So in hot weather, Coke would cost more than in cold weather. Now, an economist would say that was cute. You might say, actually, it stops the machine selling out when it's very hot. Maybe that's a beneficial thing. The public went bonkers. They just said that's disgusting. Price gouging when there's a hurricane. If there's heavy snowfall, suddenly trebling the price of snow shovels drives people nuts. So my view is that actually another reason why you need marketing and psychology in the board of companies is to point out where our human ethical sense diverges from the ethical sense of economists.
This is a very serious question to be asked about ethics and about power as well. I mean, people who are good at it, people who have that the manner of thinking which you have a lot of power over other people. And what I wonder is a final question. I mean, you talked a lot about...
One very quick thing, which is that there are also some bloody weird effects, and I don't know how to judge them, okay? One thing I do say, by the way, is I think behavioural economics should be widely read and widely understood, so people have better introspective insight into their decisions, and as Kahneman would say, into some of the false predictions they may make. I mean, things like effect forecasting. When I go to Portugal on holiday, I have a great time. Therefore, I assume that if I retire to Portugal, I'm going to be that happy for the whole of my retirement. What actually happens is that your level of happiness tends to basically regress to the mean. So you'd probably be pretty happy for the first 2 months of your retirement, but then you spend yourself going, oh, fucking hell, sick of eating all this swordfish or what, I don't know. And so, so we often make very bad predictions about what will actually affect and maintain our happiness. And so people should be educated. There should be school lessons on this stuff. There are weird things, however, which I don't know how to explain, which is I've spent 8 years of my life studying this stuff. I know when I go to an airline website and it says London to Toulouse, £74.99, only 4 seats left at this price. It says, I know, it's trying to exploit my scarcity bias. But it still works. So even though I know it's exploiting my scarcity bias, I've spent years reading, I go, but I better book these bloody seats now, because they'll go. So the tragic thing is it kind of works on me, even when I know how it works. So how to explain that, I don't know.
Well, the question is then, who should we trust? Who should we listen to? These leaders of thought, companies, thinkers. Who should we trust? Who should we listen to? And who should we absolutely not trust?
I think... Bloody hell. There's a whole interesting Darwinian debate about this, about the fact that modern society and the modern corporation has provided a kind of fertile breeding ground for psychopaths and sociopaths. And there's some suggestion... Actually, I think he wanted it edited out from his talk, but Geoffrey Miller, who's a very good Darwinian psychologist and author of The Mating Mind, he's teaching at a business school in New York, and he thinks about 30 to 40% of his students are basically psychopaths. By the way, being taught economics makes you much more psychopathic. Your behaviour and things like the ultimatum game will change. And so economics is actually basically the production of... I mean, he was asking for films to show to students to illustrate ethical dilemmas in business. And I think he was horrified by actually his... the basic student mentality in business is if it's legal and it makes you money and it benefits the shareholders, then it's okay. Okay? Now, I suggested the film he should show was Schindler's List, and he should ask the question, does Oskar Schindler pay enough attention to maximising shareholder value rather than getting distracted by extraneous humanitarian concerns? And I pointed out that since these are business school students, they actually would think it was a serious question. They wouldn't actually spot that it was a joke. Okay. The interesting question is, who do we trust? We trust people who've got skin in the game. This is Taleb's point in the book Anti-Fragile. If you're a family business, your name is attached to your firm. If you're the founder of a business and your name is attached to your firm, you have reputational skin in the game. Okay? And I suppose if you read Anti-Fragile, the point is you have to ask the question every time, what has this guy got to lose by ripping me off? And I think we instinctively do this. I think we instinctively have, my colleague in the advertising industry, Robin White, calls it the reputation reflex. That we instinctively like doing business with people who have something to lose by doing us wrong. Now, in fairness to McDonald's, who are widely disparaged, I trust McDonald's because, one, they depend on my repeat customer. A tourist restaurant knows I'm never going to come back. That is basically a zero-sum game. If you want a bad meal, go to a tourist restaurant. Their whole interest is, how can I sell this Brit, this stupid Anglo, as shit a meal as possible and charge him as much as I possibly can. Because let's face it, he's never going to come back, and he can't do much reputational damage because the bastard's flying back to Gatwick in 2 days' time. He's not, I'm not going to go around Kent going, if you go to Marrakesh, don't go to the third restaurant along. Okay, now, TripAdvisor, interestingly, may change this. So in certain low trust fields, what you might call those fields where markets that should exist collapse because of the asymmetry of information, the lemons markets. Another market I give as a perfect example of that is the timeshare market. It's a brilliant idea, timeshare. It should be all over the place. I don't want to buy a second home and go to the same bastard place every bloody weekend, but I quite like to have access to 4 different homes which I go to twice a year. That's cool. Okay. Now, had Hilton and Marriott and Holiday Inn and big brands got into that timeshare market, their brand reputation would have kept them honest, and the timeshare market would have flourished far more than it did. What happened is it was such a good idea, it was insanely lucrative. A bunch of dodgy geezers got into timeshare, and the whole market basically collapsed as far as trust goes. So yes, you can trust brands because they've got a huge reputational sunk cost in their brand investment, which they stand to lose if they rip you off. In fairness to McDonald's, I was sitting down watching at Sky News, and there was a news story on Sky News which said, now, not like the Souk restaurant is basically a zero-sum game. McDonald's needs, one, that I don't damage their reputation, and that they don't do anything that harms their reputation. 2, they need me to keep coming back, because there are lots of McDonald's, and I have maybe 200 surviving or 300 surviving potential McDonald's consumption opportunities in the rest of my life, which they're depending on. Okay? The tourist restaurant has no... Have you ever been to Granada in Spain? The entire population in Granada in Spain is either tourists or students. There's a big university and there's the Alhambra. So loads of people do a day trip from Malaga or something. Is it Malaga? It will be Malaga. Okay, so every restaurant knows basically every customer as a one-off. It is the worst service and the worst food I've ever had anywhere in the world. Everything in the place is shit. I mean, really, really. I mean, you've got the Alhambra, but everybody's an arsehole. Okay? Whereas in your local butcher or McDonald's, they depend on your repeat custom, and they're frightened of reputational harm. And they have, therefore, reputational skin in the game. Now, I was watching Sky News, and it came on Sky News at like 3 o'clock in the morning that 15 people have been taken ill after eating at a Schaumburg, Illinois area McDonald's. Okay? Now, hold on a second, none of them died, right? A few people got the shits from McDonald's. And it's on the news, not in Chicago, when that might be relevant, it's on the fucking news in London, right? Okay? No, I'm thinking, hold on a second. There must be 100 restaurants all over Chicago where people get the shits every goddamn day. It doesn't even get on the Chicago news. So something about McDonald's reputational fragility keeps them honest. So trust brands because they've got an upfront... Now, here's a brief to anybody in economics who wants to get in touch with me. Ben Polak at Yale believes there's a Nobel Prize to be won in economics in the subject of reputational game theory. Okay, so if anybody thinks they can win that Nobel Prize and wants to just ask me a question over the phone so I can be put down as like the 7th name on the paper, for God's sake, get in touch. But there is, okay, you can trust people who've got something to lose by fucking you over, basically. And that might be a reputation to lose, it might be future custom to lose, it might be because they know my dad and my dad's bigger than them. I mean, we should remember that the mafia make these things work through other means, okay? But I like to do business with people I can hurt. And I like to do business with people who are playing an iterative version of capitalism, not a zero-sum, one-off version of capitalism. If you notice, the strategies you adopt in things like the prisoner's dilemma are totally different for iterative strategies than for one-offs. And generally for iterative strategies, they're much more, what's the word? They're much less self-interested, much more likely to be altruistic than one-off approaches. Now, I would argue that advertising, because it's an upfront expense that proves long-term intent, is correctly interpreted by the consumer as suggesting that the business that advertises is playing the repeat game version of capitalism, not the souk zero-sum game version of capitalism. So that would be my question about who to trust.
Well, there we go then. I mean, trust McDonald's, don't trust business school students, and
no psychopaths. No, absolutely.
If you're after a Nobel Prize, then Rory Sutherland.
I wouldn't ask for any of the money either. I'd be happy with, of course, the reputation. Which, if you think about it, if you're getting a Nobel Prize for reputational game theory, you should actually give the money away, since the reputation in itself would be of good enough value, I think.
There we go. Rory Sutherland, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Anytime. Thanks very much indeed.